Some of the disorders which are dominant in the human species are seen here in this. Now, there are a lot of dominant disorders, but they're very rare, like I said, because they cause disadvantages, and since they always show up, you're not going to see them very often. A famous one is dwarfism, or the formal name achondroplasia, which is one specific type of dwarfism, which is actually inherited through dominance patterns. That means if you have at least one copy of a chromosome with a gene that's actually causing achondroplasia, you're going to be a dwarf. You also have the Dwarfism syndrome, which is that whenever the child is born with a defect on their lip and also the palate, and so that creates problems, of course, and most of these children have to get surgery to fix that. And you also have Marfan Syndrome, which is when it causes elongation of the limbs and fingers. So you see, you look a little bit like a disproportionate giant, and it's also because of a dominant disorder. Another dominant disorder is called Huntington's disease, and that one causes a degeneration of the nerve impulse mechanisms in the brain, which causes problems of mental retardation, degeneration of mental faculties, and control of the motor functions, and eventually death. And another one is called the Treacher-Collins syndrome, which you can see here is the absence of proper alignment of the cheekbones and other facial structures, and sometimes also accompanied by mental retardation, but not very often. It's mostly a deformity disorder. Now you can see that because these disorders are normally considered in society, even though, I mean, nobody should frown upon someone just because of their disorders, but in society, the reality of it is that people tend to exclude people with these disorders, and so that there's going to be less mating among people who have these disorders, and so you're going to have a less likelihood for these things to be part of the population. All right? But there's not necessarily anything more wrong with these people. A lot of them can have full, healthy, normal lives if they actually deal with the problems that they're associated with their particular genetic anomaly. Now remember also that what you call an anomaly today might be the future of the human race tomorrow if environmental conditions change. Let's say, for example, that everybody beyond 5 feet was suddenly killed by something tremendous that killed everybody beyond 5 feet. The only members of the human race who will be left will be children and members of the species that had achondroplasia. So you see that you can't just look at something and consider a disorder and then say that that's a bad thing. There's no such thing as a bad gene, although of course some genes cause death and a lack of ability to have children, and then evolutionarily that's obviously a bad or a deleterious mutation. But considering a disorder like this deleterious is not as clear-cut as you would think. All right? So, some examples of recessive disorders or autosomal recessive disorders are seen here. Albinism, which is the lack of pigmentation in either the eyes, the hair, or the skin color, or even a combination of those. Canavan syndrome, which actually causes mental retardation and other developmental problems among children. Phenylketonuria, called PKU also. Every child in the world that's born in a developed hospital is immediately tested by PKU by getting a little pencil or a marker and scratching the back of their foot to make sure they don't have this disease. Because the thing is, if you're born with this disease, you are unable to process a certain type of amino acid. All right? And so if you avoid eating that, you never develop a problem. So if you catch that early on, before the baby even feeds for the first time, you can put him in a special diet and he will never have a problem in life. But if the baby eats this, it's going to start accumulating this chemical in the body, and after a certain time it becomes toxic and causes all sorts of physiological and neurological problems. Another famous problem that actually causes death, and before the late 21st century, 20th century and early 21st century, it was actually a death sentence as early as 12 years old, is something called cystic fibrosis. Nowadays, some kids live to be 20, maybe 30 years old with proper medication and medical intervention, but this is basically a disorder characterized by fluids gathering inside the lungs, and because the nutrients are not being absorbed properly and processed properly by the pancreas and other organs of the body, and in conjunction what ends up happening is a complete degeneration of the breathing faculties, and the person ends up, especially as she grows up into adolescence, and the amount of oxygen necessary to sustain the organs of a now growing organism, which is very tall, changes, and the efficiency of the respiratory system is not going to be enough to actually protect the child from death. And so that's why typically with cystic fibrosis, when they reach adolescence, they end up having respiratory problems that ultimately end up killing the organism. And another example is going to be Wilson's disease. And Wilson's disease basically leads to this shrink pigmentation on your eyes when you actually get accumulation of iron on all over your body, which is usually seen as the puber problem, which literally looks metallic. And this will also cause all sorts of problems, including infertility and mental retardation and physiological problems across the body, which also might end up causing the death of the organism. And this is because they are incapable of processing the iron from their diet. So it's Wilson's disease because of the lack of enzymes. Another famous one is called Tay-Sachs disease. And Tay-Sachs happens because fat accumulates certain areas of the body, including the nerve system, and ends up generating physiological and neurological problems that end up killing the child as well. Most of these die as babies because of this accumulation of fat, which prevents the normal functioning of organs and the brain. Another one, it's called Galactosemia, and that's the lack of the ability to process galactose, which is not the same thing as lactose intolerance, which is also inheritable, but galactosemia is the inability to process the simple sugar, galactose. And when that happens, it causes also accumulation of galactose to toxic levels inside the cell, which leads to all sorts of problems, including liver damage, enlarged livers, cataracts, brain damage, and all things like that. So these children have to avoid milk and any other type of product that contains the milk sugar called galactose. And so these are some examples of disorders that we see in human beings because of either autosomal or recessive disorders. Now these particular ones here are the recessive ones. You're only going to have these if you have a paired recessive gene or a hemizygous for that particular trait. All right? And you can add to these, by the way, the sex-linked recessive traits such that we talked about, like Duchenne muscular dystrophy, hemophilia, Marfan Syndrome, Fragile X, and color blindness. All right? All right, guys. So on the next video, I'm going to talk about how you can see these patterns of inheritance through Punnett squares as well as pedigrees. See you guys then.